Could now panel 1, which is on Erasure of Contributions, come to the front? And as they do so, I'm just going to introduce Sue Lemos, who is an MA and PhD funded candidate at the University of Warwick. This Sue right here. Sue has presented at numerous conferences across the country and the globe as an exceptional student and a volunteer at Haringo Vanguard. Not only is she helping to diversify academia through her research into the Black LGBT+ movement, but she's also transforming our understanding of Black activism. I met her through the Young Historians Project, and it is my privilege to welcome her as the chair of our first panel today on Erasure of Contributions. Do you want to do it up here? Yeah?
Okay. Right. Thanks, Olivia, for that introduction. I didn't write that myself, so that's really nice. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to say that I'm very happy to be here, despite travelling all the way from Coventry. And I would also like to say thank you to Olivia and Claire for inviting me to participate in this conference. It is an absolute pleasure to be part of a student-led initiative to centre the margins and provide a platform for undergraduate students to share their work on historical actors who are so often overlooked, erased and marginalised from dominant historical narratives. So my own historical interests were... How do I move this? Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. So my own historical interests have been guided by my yearning to uncover the history of my forebearers in Britain. When I started my undergraduate history degree at the University of Warwick in 2014, there was a conspicuous lack of Black British history in the curriculum, a myopic view of history that I had already become accustomed to through our national curriculum in my school years. I later learnt about the organisation of women of Asian and African descent at a Warwick Anti-Sexism Society event, and the presentation was actually led by another Black woman student who had done her own research as part of one of her assignments at Warwick. So OED was formed in 1978 during a meeting at the Warwick Students' Union and created a national network of Black and Asian women's groups. Researching OAD and the Black British women's movement was the beginning of an intellectual journey which led me to my current interest in the history of Black political activism in 20th century Britain and the practice of documenting the history of the margins. Okay, so I've been thinking about 4 central questions about the practice of history making, especially in relation to the politics of Black liberation. Who is producing this history? How is this history produced? For whom? Yeah. And for what purpose? Okay. With these questions in mind, I'd like to share some of my thoughts and observations from the process of researching the Black gay and lesbian movement in late 20th century Britain. Okay. So, for my master's, I'm focusing on the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre as a case study of the Black, gay and lesbian movement in Britain. The centre emerged out of the London Black Lesbian and Gay Group after the Greater London Council awarded the BLGC project funding in 1986. The BLGC initially used Black as a descriptor to define people of First Nation and Third World descent. This idea of political Blackness was inherited from the strategic essentialism of African and African Caribbean and South Asian settlers who adopted the revolutionary language of Blackness from the Black Power movement to signify their political coalition on the periphery of hegemonic white Britishness in the late 1960s and 1970s. In other words, Black was redefined as a political category to describe a multiracial coalition on the margins of white Britishness among non-white people. This concept of Blackness was always highly contentious, though, with cultural theorists such as Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall marking the 1980s and 1990s as a period where the political purchase of this definition of black began to wane in favour of its definition to describe African and African Caribbean ethnicity, which we're more familiar with today. The BLGC also changed its definition in the 1990s, reflecting the wider political shift. Although my research accounts for the unstable parameters of black political activism, I adopt the theoretical and political usage of black to define the specificity of the structural positioning and racialisation of the African diaspora in Britain. So thinking of black as a term to theorise what blackness is in post-war Britain instead of just a term to describe a political unity. That said, in my research, I've chosen to follow the contemporaneous terminology used to describe events, campaigns, and organisations. Okay. So what was the BLGC? To put it simply, the BLGC was a community space for gay and lesbian people of colour to access resources and socialise. It moved around London, initially securing a space in Tottenham and later moving to Peckham. Finding a permanent building proved hard for the organisation due to homophobic landlords who would refuse to lease their properties. Soon after its opening, the BLGC became an epicentre of political activism and community building for gay and lesbian people of colour in Britain and beyond. The centre had a helpline, library, cultural events, a national newsletter, and organised conferences such as the Black Gay Men's Conference and the first International Gay and Lesbian People of Colour Conference held in London in 1990. The centre and its members were involved in demonstrations against the introduction of Section 28 of the Local Government Act in 1988 under the Thatcher government. Section 28 banned the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities and became a national concern for the gay and lesbian community in Britain. Although the centre was the first of its kind to receive public funding in Britain, and possibly the world, it remains a real lacuna, along with the Black, Gay and Lesbian movement in the historiography on post-war Britain. At present, the Black, Gay and Lesbian movement is virtually unstudied within the field of British history. Gilroy's concept of post-colonial melancholia diagnoses the epistemic erasure of black people from hegemonic Britishness as a response to loss of empire and post-colonial migration in the wake of anti-colonial movements in the mid-20th century. As such, the field of Black British history has only recently emerged in the academy. Black people, on the other hand, have engaged in community efforts to preserve, archive, and pass down their own history. The image there from The Heart of the Race, which has been slightly cut off by my graphics, was actually written by the Book Collective, who were part of OAD, and that is the first black her story about black women in Britain. Where was I? So, there was a groundswell of activity in the 1980s with publications, cultural events, and black lesbian activist Linda Bellos leading the introduction of Black History Month in 1987. In our current moment, we are witnessing a wave of black historical production in and outside of the academy. So my research on the BLGC draws on feminist oral history methodologies and documents held in the Ruckus Black LGBTQ+ archive, launched in 2005 by two black gay artists and activists, Topher Campbell and Ajamu X. Ajamu X is pictured right there. The archive is located in the London Metropolitan Archives and holds various personal collections and ephemera from Ajamu's and Topher's contemporaries. Almost kind of like people knew that it was a significant moment, I should keep this, but I don't know what I'll do with it. And Veronica said that to my interview. She was like, I don't know why I kept this, but I have all these things. So Veronica Mackenzie, who's also pictured there at London Pride. At Black Pride. Veronica Mackenzie is a black lesbian filmmaker and former committee member of the BLGC, and is currently leading the Haringey Vanguard, a BME LGBTQ+ heritage and oral history project in partnership with the LMA. She also produced Under Your Nose, the first documentary on the BLGC in 2016. The documentary features interviews with three former workers, Savitri Hensman, Dennis Carney, and Dorothea Smart. To close, I want to show you a clip of the documentary, but before I do that, I just want us to reflect on the closing line of the first Lesbian of Colour, Her Story, Making Black Waves, published in 1993. We are the pioneers of our own future. In the 1980s and 1990s, Black queer people were leading a movement, and they continue to be pioneers in recording, archiving, and sharing their history. Okay.
Did you know there was a black lesbian and gay centre just down there?
Oh my God, no.
What would you think about a centre being right there?
That's for me, actually. We all got a centre somewhere.
Those
Documentation, I think, is so important because so much of what we did is just visible now. I mean, I've never tried Googling Black Lesbian and Gay Centre Project, but if I did, jack shit come up.
I was probably the longest serving worker. Yeah, you were 8.5 years. 8.5 years? I think it's touched a lot of people's lives in one way or another. And I think it made black lesbians and gays much visible than we have been before.
The UK was the first country in the world to have a black lesbian and gay centre.
I mean, there was the London Lesbian and Gay Centre. I didn't feel like it was the space for me. I felt it was predominantly, it was definitely predominantly white, and it was predominantly male. Black lesbians and black feminists, black women, were involved in this whole creative, cultural scene. Them producing so much fantastic work, and so much of it has just disappeared because it's not documented,
So I'm just now going to pass on to the undergraduate speakers, and I'm going to pass on to Erasure of Contributions from the University of Leeds, and the title of the project is Identifying West Africans in the French Resistance.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me today. So I'll just go straight into my research project. So it's titled Identifying West Africans in the French Resistance, and it's part of a wider ongoing research project alongside my supervisor in Leeds, Dr. Nina Waterworth, on identifying members of the internal French resistance from France's former colonies. And I've just completed my first year of research and will go on to continue in the summer of 2020. So I'll start off by talking about the importance of the research, then I'll go on to the background and context, talk about my methodology, and we'll end off by talking about one resistance fighter that stood out to me. So, what our research aims to do is bring to light the stories of West Africans who have been overlooked in kind of the mainstream historical discussions around the Second World War. And so we try to also focus on the micro, not just the macro, so bring awareness to West Africans who took part in the resistance by not only kind of as a group, but their individual stories, and bring them to life. So this is relevant to discussions going on in France right now about how and why their colonial troops should be commemorated. And in June 2019, 22 French personalities wrote a tribune in a French newspaper, Le Monde, demanding that the French President Macron properly commemorate the West African soldiers who took part in the Provence landings, which I'll talk about a bit later. So this research is not only important, but it's necessary at this moment in time. So, what is the French resistance? So the French resistance was composed of individuals, movements, and groups known as maquis who fought against Nazi Germany in the Second World War between 1940 and 1943. So if I asked all of you about the D-Day landings, I'm sure you would know what I was talking about. You would have, studied it in history lessons or seen the commemorations on the TV. And yeah, this is because collectively D-Day is portrayed as a crucial event that led to the liberation of France, as well as kind of the victory of the Allied forces. However, what is less known is that D-Day, the liberation of France, and I would argue just, the victory of the Allied forces would not have been as successful or possible without the West Africans and other colonial troops. And this is because they took part in the Provence landings, which took place after D-Day, and hence it's kind of been overlooked. So 60 to 80% of the troops that were involved in the Provence landings were from France's former colonies, such as West Africa. So most of these West Africans came from the Confederation of West Africa and French Equatorial Africa, as this map shows. So these includes countries such as Senegal, Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso. And despite France's heavy involvement in West Africa, dating as far back as the 17th century, and their use of West African troops, they continue to be overlooked in these discussions around the Second World War. And I'm going to be honest, as someone who's of West African heritage and who studies French, I had no idea that, West African peoples were not only kind of integral, but, played a huge part in the victory of the Allied forces until I started this research project. So I'd go a step further and say not only have these histories been ignored and overlooked, but they've also been actively erased and removed from mainstream narratives. So I'll give two examples of this to demonstrate my point. I'll talk about the Thiaroye massacre of 1944 and the French policy of blanchissement, which is whitening. So in September 1944, the French government enacted this policy. And Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French forces, when it became near that victory was coming forth for the Allies, he took the weapons and the uniforms away from these West African troops and gave them instead to the white soldiers from mainland France. And to make matters worse, these West Africans were held in camps and then they were sent back to West Africa. So this was done to restore French self-confidence, and Charles de Gaulle wanted to emphasize the role of the white soldiers, unfortunately at the erasure of their West African counterparts. So I'd also argue that not only was this event whitened, but the history and the memory of these soldiers has been whitened because we see that there's that films and photos are missing. And so this was not just during the war, but this is also during the post-war period. However, it's important to note that this whitening process was not total because this wasn't the case for Black Caribbeans from like Guadeloupe and Martinique, who also took part in the Second World War. So my second example is the Thiaroye massacre of 1944. So this provides a chilling example of how these West African troops were silenced by the French state. So on the 1st of December 1944, there was a serious clash between West African soldiers and the French state at a demobilization camp in Dakar, which is just outside of Dakar in Senegal. And this was as a result of West Africans expressing rage at their unfair treatment and their delayed payment. And unfortunately, this resulted in West African troops being killed by the French authorities. And the French state officially recognizes that 35 people were killed, and they framed it as a mutiny. However, this is highly disputed by French historians, such as Armand Mabon, who argues that the number could be as high as 400 who were killed, and that there's been a state cover-up by the French, which it isn't a bold statement to make because they've done this in the Algerian War and stuff like this. So yeah. So now I'm just going to talk briefly about my methodology. So I started off kind of looking at the French online archives, which are available to anyone, and they include extensive lists of all the resistance fighters in mainland France, the colonial troops as well. So I was able to kind of extract the West Africans from that database and create my own solely for the West Africans. So I was able to uncover just under 200 men and women, and this included basic information such as their name, date of birth, gender, etc. And to point out a limitation, kind of our reliance on the state archives could be seen as a limitation just because it was very hard for West African troops to get this accreditation and to get recognised, because a lot of them were sent back to West Africa. They didn't speak French. They didn't have kind of the privilege to be able to access and just acquire the accreditation. So this is a simple graph to show. So the majority of the West African troops came from Ivory Coast, Guinea and Senegal, and 7% of the West Africans that I found were women as well. So after kind of creating the database and basic information of these West Africans, I had the opportunity to go to France to conduct research in the archives. So I went to some archives in Paris, as well as the south of France. And this allowed me to really delve deeper into these West African, these stories and of individuals who kind of stood out to me, and gain richer, more qualitative data. So the next step was to kind of create profiles of West African resistance fighters that really stood out to me. And this year I was able to create 3, but I'll talk about just one for today. And kind of the structure, I focused on their pre-war life, what they did during the war, as well as their post-war life, so how they got the accreditation, and what they did after. So I'll go on to Jeanne Vial, who is an amazing woman. She really stood out to me, and her story just really was almost movie-like. So she was a resistance fighter, journalist, and female rights activist. So she was of mixed heritage, born to a Congolese mother and French father. And at the onset of the war, she joined one of the 3 major resistance movements called Combat in France, and as a clandestine agent, where she collected kind of intelligence on the movement of Nazis. So she was also the first black woman to be appointed on the Senate in 1947. And I've kind of skipped ahead, but her kind of work was kind of making waves, and her house was raided actually by the Nazis, and she was taken to a concentration camp and then a women's prison. And there's kind of a lot of mystery surrounding how she escaped, but she did, and that's how she kind of went on to kind of be selected on the Senate. So after she. So she also was appointed on the UN Ad Committee for Slavery, and she tragically died in a plane crash in 1920. So in recent years, there have been attempts to kind of commemorate these colonial troops through films and graphic novels. And most recently, there's been a play that came out about the Thiaroye massacre. However, more needs to be done in terms of kind of getting not just popular commemoration, but we need kind of state commemoration by the French government, and to get these histories into schools. And I hope that my research kind of will be able to contribute to that. And just because I know that time's kind of closing, my supervisor kind of went to France last week to speak to officials about kind of our research, and there was talks about getting kind of some streets named after some of the resistance fighters that we uncovered. So hopefully, if you're in Paris anytime soon, look out for a street named after Vial. So thank you so much, and I look forward to listening to the rest. Thank you.
Thank you, that was amazing. I'm going to pass on to Jo Moore from the University of York.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the miners' strike and something that's called consciousness raising. So particularly in the 1980s, you saw a massive coalition of across a broad demographic of society that had previously been sort of passive, becoming active, organising, struggling for their rights. But I just want to provide you with a bit of context about the miners' strike, or else it might make the rest of the talk a little bit difficult to understand. So in 1984, the miners' strike broke out in the UK. It was the second strike in 10 years. But in order for you to fully appreciate the contribution that the different groups I'm going to talk about made to the strike, as I said, it's important to understand the context. Now, the United Kingdom has a very long and violent labour history, stretching sort of all the way back to 1381. But in 1974, the miners struck against pit closures, and this forced the government down a path of conflict with the National Union of Mine Workers. The miners responded by using flying pickets to close the steelworks, and meant that coal couldn't be imported. Eventually, what happened was the steelworks was closed. Then the miners won the dispute, winning sort of all sorts of pay increases and things like that. But then in 1979, Margaret Thatcher came to power. And of course, strategy of neoliberalism is all about privatisation, and her plan was to close the pits. So essentially set her on a collision course with Arthur Scargill, President of the National Union of Mine Workers, and he again attempted to use the same tactic, close the coal works, win the strike. But Thatcher was clever. Say what you like about her, she was a clever woman. So her tactic was to fight a war of attrition. She'd starve the miners back to work. She even famously came out and said, "No one will be more pleased than I am when pieces return to the coalfields and the miners have gone back to work." Of course, obviously, we know what this really means is that when they've gone back to work and lost the strike. And of course, not at the time, but it was later admitted by most of the cabinet, particularly Thatcher's favourite spin doctor, Timothy Bell. So the way she'd do this by starving them back to work was by sequestering the funds. So obviously miners are on strike, they're not going to get paid. You know, they need a source of income to live, to work, pay for food, support their family, and things like that. So once the funds were sequestered, the miners had nothing to live on. Essentially, the strike would collapse. And now this is where all these different groups we're going to kind of talk about come in. All sorts of things here, fundraising and even joining the miners on the picket lines, just all kinds of solidarity from different groups which allowed the strike to go on, and which it probably couldn't have done without these different kind of group support. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the LGSM, formed by a guy called Mark Ashton and another fella called Michael Jackson. Mark Ashton, you know, famously said, this group's all about solidarity. He said one community should give solidarity to another. It's illogical to say, you know, I belong to one group and I'm into defending that group. You know, I don't care about anything else. The two men who formed it originally started off small, you know, collecting donations at Pride marches in London. In one instance, they actually raised about £22,500, which is, you know, an absolutely massive amount for striking miners in South Wales. But they did all sorts of other things. Concerts called, one was called Pits and Perverts in the Electric Ballroom in London. Huge financial success, raised about £6,500, which is, I think it equates to about £20,000 nowadays. Again, for striking miners, so absolutely fantastic. Another group, bit different to the first one, were black miners. Now, black miners didn't have the same freedom to protest in the pit communities because of racial and geographical reasons. Because of racial tensions in the country, there were only a minority of pits where black miners could actually work. This was mainly in Nottingham and Doncaster. And Nottingham, it has to be remembered, is a region that has an absolutely overwhelming sort of anti-strike position. The Nottinghamshire miners did not want to go on strike, and by the start of 1985, I think 96% of the miners in Nottingham were back in work. Thatcher also famously prevented flying pickets from descending and encouraging miners to break the strike. So of course many people in Nottingham were, you know, didn't want to break it and went with that. Many black miners also had to fear an institutionally racist police force. You know, one miner is quoted saying, as I went to the front of the picket line where they were serving food, you know, I was a big lad, the police would recognise me, they had me marked. So a lot of these young men, around about 30 years old, felt that sticking out as black men, especially in an industry that was largely white, they would be exposed as being easily identifiable. They believed they faced a greater danger from the police and that even management would single them out for better treatment, for special treatment. Clearly, a lot of miners actually felt the union wasn't capable of looking after them, and in quite a few cases, this sentiment did prove to be true, where the union wouldn't look after them, and that was equally prevalent in Doncaster. One story of a black miner called Mr. Mortimer was out jogging with his friends, and as he ran by a working miner, one of the miners said to him, "Are you not supporting the lads?" At which point, a policeman threatened to arrest him if he went to stand with the pickets. On another occasion, he says the police began to chase him for absolutely no reason at all. He dodged 2 of them, but an inspector later rugby tackled him. 6 other police officers jumped on him and they threw him in the back of a transit van and asked him where he lived and worked. But despite the intense and heightened fear that many black miners felt, even in a region which was particularly anti-strike, many of them still did incredibly bravely come out on strike and participate in fundraising activities. Black miners drank at the Working Men's Club and participated in local fundraising activities, and at Notting Hill Carnival there was a huge fundraising effort where a massive amount of funds which went to support the strike were actually raised from. Unfortunately, there's no recorded number, but we are told it's a very big amount. And finally, another group, and perhaps the most work has been done on this group, are Women Against Pit Closures. And it's been said that the maintenance of the strike owed more to the emergence of women's groups than to any other single factor. Initially, women began organising in soup kitchens, providing welfare advice, organising and distributing food parcels, helping with utilities companies and local council issues. They found that writing to companies as a group meant it carried more weight than if they wrote as individuals. And women who were involved in the strike said, "We felt this practical help was of real value to the communities facing economic deprivation, and it also gave us an opportunity to pass on and support directly the miners and their families." In fact, there's a really good story of one group who, after being denied use of the village kitchen hall, did like a sit-in and occupied it for about 5 days till they were eventually able to use it. So, of course, this didn't stop there. After the strike, they created a national basis for organisation. The movement came up with specific aims, supporting the strike, strengthening women's organisations more generally, and organising just struggling, for popular rights, education for women, but also, still maintaining a close relationship with the NUM. So, as I said, just to come back to the main point, the effect of all this was that the miners' funds had been sequestered. The strike couldn't have gone on as long as it did, without the help from these groups, without all the fundraising they've done. But equally as much, it's about solidarity. There's a quote from a miner you see there. He says, "The food is definitely a help, but the solidarity they are showing means more than that to us. It shows they're thinking of us here." And of course, it was about raising awareness for each other's struggles. Another quote from another miner there. I think he was giving a speech at, I think it may have been a Labour rally. "You've worn our badge, coal not dull, and you know what harassment means as we do. Now we will pin your badge on us, we will support you. It won't change overnight, but now 140,000 miners know that there are other causes and other problems. We know about blacks and gays and nuclear disarmament, and we will never be the same." Of course, as Sue alluded to as well, all kinds of crossover there with Section 28. The 1985 Labour Party, the National Union of Mine Workers fought against that in itself. So you can see massive solidarity that had been going on in the 80s, and of course there's a continuation of the 60s and the 70s. This kind of raised consciousness, though, was something that the right hated, something that they, absolutely feared. And that's what neoliberalism was about, so it's important that we try not to understand it on its own terms, it's been about individual freedoms, flourishing entrepreneurship. It's about eroding solidarity and absolutely eliminating the possibility of something like democratic socialism, or just, raise consciousness. And I say raise consciousness because when the question of work or political activism becomes more generalised, and we take this optic of consciousness raising, it takes us past kind of like the standard, Leninist model of political action that's centred around the factory. Yeah, but as I said, it's absolutely everything capital feared, and there was an ideological backlash to this. If you read the Crisis of Democracy report, which does actually come a bit before, what it argues is that there's too much pressure being exerted on the system. Political activism is becoming out of control, and these sections of society need to be returned to passivity. There's too much pressure being exerted on the system. Similarly, if you want to look at home stuff, there's a really good, not so much good, but really interesting report written by Margaret Thatcher called the Authority of Government Report. And essentially, as you can see what it says on there, the challenge to the authority of government won't just come from workers. It can come from absolutely anywhere, and that should be the government's key task, to stop people organising, to stop people struggling for their rights, essentially. And of course, that's just the ideological backlash. The major backlash was things like, destroying trade unions. Trade unions have been at the forefront of efforts to improve the lives of the general population. A major reason for the constant trade, an almost fanatic attack on unions, organised labour. So they're a democratising force. It's the infrastructure that allows class consciousness to exist. But they provide a vehicle, that defends popular rights more generally. And of course, there's been a massive concerted attempt to organise a loathing around things like, to associate them with the problems of the country rather than the good things that they can provide. All of this was purposeful. None of it was accidental. The fact that we don't, not saying we don't see raised consciousness today. Yeah, of course we do, and it's getting better now. I think we just lived through that period of sorry, I'll wrap up. I've lived through that period now of where sort of these rights and these struggles have been crushed a little bit. But we're seeing the good side now. Syriza was crushed. Jeremy Corbyn was crushed, but it's okay. It's fine. New forms of consciousness are taking place, and that struggle's coming again. I'll wrap up now because I'm conscious of time. But sorry for going over. Thanks very much.
Well, that was great. Another fantastic presentation, which has actually a lot of synergies with my own work. So, yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce the next speaker, Oscar Davies Patton from the University of York, I should say, to present their paper on the Elizabethan Chapel and people of colour.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the other speakers. This is sort of coming from my dissertation research. It's not my dissertation research. It's sort of a repurposing and an idea I had that would have been slightly too hard to actually pass off as dissertation research, but I've repurposed it. So the Chapel Royal was the monarch's primary place of devotion. It's an institution rather than a building. It travelled with the monarch in spirit, though chapels at royal residences such as Greenwich, Hampton Court and Whitehall could all continue to hold iconographical reminders of the monarch's presence despite their physical absence. The study of people of colour in Tudor England has, like the study into the Chapel Royal, only begun in earnest over the past 3 decades. Chapel study has remained focused on musicological factors and the relationship of its ritual with the monarch and wider political concerns. Crucially absent from these investigations is a consideration of the social networks that bound chapel men together, and with the secular court musicians who supported daily and holy day services. While it's perhaps unlikely that any gentlemen of the Chapel Royal were non-white, it's the secular musicians of Elizabeth's court that non-white presences may be found, and their interaction with the Chapel Royal further explored. By continuing her father's policy of aggressive cultural propagation in the domestic and international sphere, Elizabeth laid the foundations of a potent, stylised, ceremonial form which has continued to some degree to the present day. by locating the role that people of colour and marginalised groups had to play in the Elizabethan Chapel Royal, a powerful revision of the white conception of the Tudor period may be proposed. The presence of John Blank, a trumpeter, in the court of Henry VIII suggests that other non-white individuals may have populated the ranks of the musicians or singers of the Chapel Royal, hereto obscured by the inaccessibility of certain sources and the lack of specific scholarly attention. As directed chapel study remains in comparatively early days, a remarkable opportunity is presented to historians of the Tudor court, religion and visual ceremony. The invaluable work conducted by Miranda Kaufman and others into people of colour in Renaissance Europe can help to recolour chapel study, helping to direct conceptions of the Elizabethan court away from a whitewashed, overly nationalistic history and into one of diversity, nuance and oral and visual expression. The early modern period hosted a set of complex racial and religious values and prejudices. While Africans were enslaved, primarily by Portuguese and later Italian merchants, they were by no means the only group treated in this way. Many in England, where the air was too pure for a slave to breathe in, were effectively enslaved through antiquated systems of serfdom and servitude. Rather more prominent, however, were pejorative associations with heretical religions, particularly Judaism and Islam. Coincidentally, the major European slave-trading nations, Portugal, Italy and Spain, were host to a far greater population of Jews and Muslims than in England, so some association may have been made with the inhabitants of these countries with a particularly dangerous level of exoticism. Crucially, these associations would have likely been given authoritative dismissal upon service in Elizabeth's court, with all members expected to swear an oath of fealty to the Queen, particularly if they wanted to occupy a permanent position. The significant influx of Italian, Portuguese and Spanish musicians into the English court during the 16th century marks a significant shift in the makeup of the musicians at court. Aside from the temporary residence of Philip II's royal retinue during the reign of Mary I, which was primarily composed of Spaniards and one Fleming, the exodus of Jews escaping persecution in Spain and Italy, and those simply seeking musical fortunes in the court of a monarch sympathetic to music, resulted in a shift in English musical and cultural production that is only now being appropriately recognised. Musicologists have, until the late 20th century and start of the 21st, placed an unsettling emphasis on the insularity of English music, despite a clear host of distinctly international musicians. Extending this definitive identification of an international English music, the presence of Italian, Portuguese and Spanish musicians within the Chapel Royal and accompanying services likely brought marginalised groups closer to this locus of religious and cultural English identity. By integrating continental musical and cultural fashions into the English music produced in the Chapel Royal, the complexity of the cultural picture is demonstrated. Though no extant evidence has yet been discovered of people of colour within the Elizabethan Chapel Royal, a number of strong indicators are provided by two major sources of the period. The first is the striking number of international émigrés to the Elizabethan court, as displayed by the lay subsidy rolls of Elizabeth's reign. The links of Spanish, Portuguese and Italian merchants to the trade of African slaves during this period should not be dismissed. As the valuable work of Roger Pryor illustrates, potentially hundreds of Jews fled to the relative protection of England during their persecution at the hands of Italian and Spanish authorities. The early modern Jewish trade of African slaves likely brought with it a considerable level of racial diversity, and considering Pryor's claim that following 1540 the majority of foreign musicians at Henry's court were Jews, this indicates a considerable shift in the assumed racial makeup of the musicians at the Tudor court. That secular musicians performed in the Chapel Royal is shown to us through the Russian ambassador Grigory Ivanovich Mikulin's 1601 description of the organ and the wind instruments, with much other music and song, and that both Mundy's verse anthem, Our Helpless Wretch, and The Secret Sins, along with Farrant's When As We Sat in Babylon, were originally scored for concerted instruments, rather than an organ. The 1598 lay subsidy roll for court musicians highlights the extent of the internationality of Elizabeth's court, and suggests something of their treatment. Of the flutes, Piero Guy, alien, and Nico Lenia, alien, are both paid £43 for their service, with an additional £56 for Guy, compared with that of Peter Edney, an Englishman, who received £28, 16 shillings. While this subsidy roll may only display the variability of court employment, other such differences are identifiable in the wages of shagboots, with aliens receiving £31 12 shillings compared with English musicians receiving £28 16 shillings. These extra costs may have been to supplement temporary accommodation or as a gesture of goodwill, though the presence of the Jewish-Italian family, the Lupos and the Basanos, on these lists highlights the potential for complexity in the ethnic makeup of Elizabeth's musicians. As noted by Miranda Kaufman, the identification of black Tudors is difficult and often frustrating. The ambiguity of names, sources and dates proves an intimidating maze of historical investigation and negotiation, particularly under the context of Jewish migration during the 16th century. The lack of any comprehensive monograph regarding the Tudor Chapel Royal is indicative of the limitations of the historiography, and in this protean stage in its scholarship, it's vital that we fully explore and integrate such research with other movements seeking to reclaim marginalised voices within the early modern period. Thank you. Sorry for going a little bit over.
Thank you. Another amazing presentation. So I'm going to pass over to Lily Lofty from Royal Holloway, University of London, to present their paper on middle-class women and the abolition of slavery movement.
Thanks. Do I need to be here to speak more? I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much to Claire and Olivia for this amazing conference. I think it's really exciting for undergraduates to be able to be given this opportunity, and I'm really, excited to be here, so thank you. Today I'm going to be discussing the movement for the abolition of slavery and the legacy of middle-class female political activism. When I was researching, my kind of research focuses on the British Empire, and I was really interested by anti-slavery, but also by the legacies that women gained and the skills that women gained from anti-slavery to be passed on to gaining female suffrage. And when I was reading about it, historians often talk about female activists and female abolitionists, but don't necessarily talk about how kind of female suffrage was the skills female activists gained from female suffrage was through the abolition of slavery. So I was really interested by that. So the kind of structure that my paper takes is firstly through analysing female domestic influence. So the goods that women were buying in the British Empire, like tea, coffee, that sort of thing, for social emulation, and how women really gained power through that. And then how they gained a female economic influence, so how they were engaging with things like the sugar boycott of the anti-slavery movement that I'll come on to later, and how they were directly impacting the kind of world of the British Empire. And then through the female political influence, so how what kind of skills women were gaining through abolitionism, and what they were taking forward for female suffrage, things like literature, confidence, and a legacy of political influence. So this is a graph put together by Lorna Wetherall on the percentage of families' ownership of goods in a sample of inventories in England from 1675 to 1725. The kind of two sections that I'm most interested in are the first two, the gentry and tradesmen of high status. Tradesmen of high status would have been what we kind of call the middle class today, but what a lot of historians call for this period the middling sorts, which you might see throughout the presentation. So it looks at firstly table linen, which was made out of cotton grown in the British Empire plantations, china, which you would have drunk your tea out of, which table linen would have protected, and utensils for hot drinks, which you would have drunk coffee out of, which again table linen would have protected. And interestingly, as you can see here, more middle class families or middling sort families owned these goods compared to the gentry. So it just shows how middle class were using these goods actively for social emulation and to kind of define their class through the kind of goods that they owned from the British Empire. So how were women involved in this? They were sort of involved in a consumer revolution because women were the members of society buying these goods for their families. So they were the people buying the china, interested in the tea, to kind of perform their economic status. And therefore these created like conscious fashionable trends through goods such as tea, sugar and coffee. And then the kind of cultural practices through like tea ceremonies in the 18th century, which you can see here. This is more of an elite gentry type family, but this is what the middle class would have been aiming to look like, and to kind of perform their wealth by inviting women over for tea ceremonies would kind of show that. So how is this influential in an economic context? So during the abolitionist movement, there was the sugar boycott during the winter of 1791 to 92, in which 300,000 people abstained from buying slave-grown goods such as sugar and rum. And because women were buying these domestic goods, they were actively involved in this economic boycott. By stopping from buying these goods, they were directly affecting the British Empire and what kind of spurs it on. So because of this, and abolitionists were directly impacting and targeting women in their propaganda, and particularly through propaganda involving children. So when I was digging in the archives at the Angus Library at the University of Oxford, I came across really interesting propaganda that targeted women, one of which was called A Cottage Conversation, What Does Your Sugar Cost?, on the subject of Negro slavery. And a kind of trend that I found was that there was a kind of myth that was created that if you were consuming slave-grown products such as sugar, then you were effectively consuming the blood of child slaves from the colonies, which I thought was, really interesting, kind of targeting women, targeting their emotional connection to children, and just how impacted they were through this economic boycott. So how does this translate into political influence, and how were abolitionists, female abolitionists, creating political literature and skills that they would then pass on to using their skills for female suffrage? So Martha Gurney and William Fox, an address to the people of Great Britain on the propriety of abstaining from West Indian sugar and rum. So this would have been a pamphlet that would have been passed around the streets, that people would read and hopefully be inspired by. When people talk about Martha Gurney and William Fox, they often only talk about William Fox, and in fact Martha Gurney was really heavily involved in the publishing and the editing of all of these works. 50,000 copies of Gurney and Fox's pamphlet were sold in London alone, compared to Paine's Rights of Man, which sold 50,000 copies in Britain in 1791. So people, women like Martha Gurney, were getting actively involved in petitioning and that sort of thing, and gaining these political literature and skills. Similarly, Hannah More's Slavery is a really interesting piece of work on kind of emotional, creative literature that women were writing about. Hannah More's kind of, she tends to be the elite side of middle class, but it's still really interesting to compare the differences between like factual pamphlets like this and also emotional literature that would have been circulated. So now moving on to female political confidence, which I think is really important to understand that this wasn't easy for women to speak out in this day and age. So this is an image of the Anti-Slavery Society Convention in London in 1840, and as you can see in the image, there are women kind of depicted on the outskirts, but a lot of women were refused entry into the convention. One of whom was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was an American activist and fought significantly for women's rights, but also for anti-slavery. And she was a really interesting woman. She argued in a lot of her literature that this anti-slavery movement could not exist without the impact of women. It could not exist without the skills of women, and that men could not do this alone. And this was clearly felt by men. One of the leading abolitionists of the time was William Wilberforce, and he wrote in a letter to T. Babington, "All private exertions for such an object become their character, but for ladies to meet, to publish, to go from house to house, stirring up petitions, these appear to me proceedings unsuited to the female character." So it wasn't just females that were kind of conscious of this confidence, but it was also men who didn't like it so much. So when I was digging through the archives at the London School of Economics in the Women's Library, I was really, really fascinated by women who were both involved in anti-slavery but also involved in female suffrage. And one of two of these women are called Jane Wigham, who married John Wigham and through him inherited a stepdaughter, Eliza Wigham. And together they became this sort of duo for female activism in anti-slavery, but also in female suffrage. So in 1846, they became the president and secretary of the Edinburgh Ladies' Emancipation Society. In 1863, Eliza Wigham wrote The Anti-Slavery Cause in America and Its Martyrs. And again in 1863, Eliza joined the Clementina Taylor's Lady London Emancipation Society and joined the fight in Contagious Diseases Act in 1864. So you can see how women were kind of using their skills gained by the anti-slavery movement, like literature, confidence. This is like a mix of all of them, really. Petitioning and that sort of thing in both suffrage and anti-slavery, which I think is really important. So just to finish with, I mentioned the Contagious Diseases Act of 1864 beforehand. This was an act that subjected sex workers to quite invasive medical examinations that a lot of women acted against because they often a lot of sexual abuse went on with the invasive exams. And one of the women who got involved in this was a woman called Josephine Butler, and she used both her understanding politically of the anti-slavery movement and the skills that she gained from that through literature and political letter writing, and actively used this to fight against the Contagious Diseases Act. So she wrote in this letter that similarly how politicians couldn't understand the lives of slaves on plantations and colonies, they still helped to emancipate them or partially emancipate them. And similarly, politicians couldn't understand the lives of women and particularly sex workers on the streets. But they could still help them in gaining their kind of freedom and rights. So I thought that was really interesting how she doesn't just use the skills, but she's using her actual political knowledge of anti-slavery to target politicians. So just some conclusions. Historians often use the ideology of separate spheres. Women, this kind of gives an example of how women weren't just involved in a private sphere, but even if they were still actively engaged in public and private spheres. I think whilst historians have understood anti-slavery and female suffrage separately, we need to start bringing them together now to understand the kind of legacy and political kind of engagement that women had with both. And similarly, women who were engaged with abolitionism were also engaged in so many other interesting movements within human rights, which I think we sort of need to bring together now to compare and contrast the two. And I think some further research would really be interesting in comparing American activists, both in abolitionism and female suffrage, and British activists, because they did connect and they did communicate. So I think it would be really interesting to discover the two. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. So before I pass on to the audience, I just want to ask a broad question and then see if we can get some dialogue going, right? Okay, so drawing on your research, how do you think the history of the margins allows us to reconfigure dominant national narratives?
Well, I think in my research, it's really... Oh, yeah, thank you. It really kind of questions what kind of French identity is and how that was created, because a lot of kind of French pride came from them winning the Second World War, and there's a lot that they don't know about kind of West Africans who took part and other kind of former colonies such as like North Africa. So yeah, I think it really does broaden that kind of idea of what makes us a nation, like what makes us French, what makes us British. It really does question those, because when you think of like the French resistance, I think most people think of a white soldier in the Alps, but like in my research I found that kind of the majority of West African resistance fighters were actually West African between 1940 and 1942, so like early on in the World War. So it really does question these myths that are just passed down.
I think in terms of my research, I was really interested in the fact that I wanted to explore ordinary people. So I didn't want to look at just simply the elites or like the kind of high society members. I was really interested in just the average kind of people and what they were doing, the tiny little things they were contributing to movements like anti-slavery. So I think that was what was really interesting that historians need to do more of, I think.
As I think I tried to show, political struggle or movements, they're not separate to each other. They're aligned. There's multiple different groups fighting for, the same thing, fighting for each other. So it's not particularly mutually exclusive. It's more broad.
Yeah, I mean, the Chapel Royal is was and still is a sort of a symbol of English, identity almost. Certainly, sort of more so then because it did arguably have more importance because the monarchy did. But yeah, sort of replotting, recolouring, I suppose, that symbol, which is something even the monarchy is still sort of perceived as being white, and its staff is perceived as being white, and also the Tudors still are by most people. I mean, the sort of reaction to the Mary Queen of Scots film last year showed how it's sort of ingrained in people's idea as white Tudor Britain, and recolouring that is, I think, something important, but hellishly difficult because of a not lack of evidence, but inaccessible evidence.
Does the audience have any questions? Just over there.
Thank you everyone for your nice talks. I have a small contribution to Farida's talk. I'm from West Africa, I'm from Senegal. And in 2004 I was doing research in linguistics in a village in the south. And I interviewed 4 Second World War veterans. And I asked them about how they were recruited, how they were trained, and what happened when they came to Europe, and what happened when they went back. And briefly, at the time when you were recruited, the whole village will come and present condolences because they had the experience of the First World War, where they had recruited like many people in those villages. Many didn't come back, including one of my, I think, great-granddad's brothers. And I tried to get 2 of them paid because only 2 were paid. I think they were getting something like £60 every 3 months. And the other 2 never got paid until they died. So I tried to help them get some money, but it never happened. So I live a little bit with that feeling of guilt or failure. I don't know, because it didn't happen. But yeah, I still have the videos. I wrote a small article to make a lot of noise, but it never really made the noise. And I was always looking for a historian who maybe to work with, but it never happened. So they all died today. I have the videos. I'm trying to find time to do something about it. I have many ideas, but linguistics has taken over my life. So, so that was the contribution. But there is still work to be done. The children are still there. They know their stories, and I think if you want to do field work and record people who at least have maybe second-hand information, it's still possible beyond the archives that you've been to. Thank you very much. I really like your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your contribution. And yeah, it's really sad that I didn't think I really spoke about it, but it was really hard to get that accreditation. And once they went to West Africa, a lot of them just haven't been recognised. And yeah, I think I would love to speak to you more about that. And I'm sure my supervisor, she's proper historian, so she would love to kind of we would love to work with you. And yeah, thank you so much. And I actually should have said at the end of my talk that if anyone had any stories or they could help out with the research, please talk to me.
I saw some other hands, I think.
Hi, I'm Penny from York, and I have a question for Farida as well. And actually, I would say you are a proper historian as well. But great presentation, and certainly all the presentations were fantastic. But I just wanted to ask, what was the most surprising thing that you found out from your research for you personally?
So for me, everything kind of surprised me because I really came into this research really not knowing anything about kind of the West African history. But I think Jane Bial's story really, really stood out to me because not only was she an amazing resistance fighter, but she went on, did so much in terms of global politics and really did a lot to kind of change French perceptions of black women. So like her story really stood out to me, and also just kind of the doing archival research, just how difficult it was and how hard it is to kind of access these, because you'd go to speak to the archivist and they wouldn't even know what I was talking about. So, and obviously the language barrier as well. So yeah, I think her story and just the difficulty in kind of accessing this information, like you said, you spoke about in your talk. Yeah, thank you so much for your question.
Are there any more questions? Down here.
Hi, it's one for Oscar. I was just wondering about some of the context, the way you could interpret the people of colour in the court. Because I was thinking we only did a bit of early modern history, cultural history in Europe, and we talked about the idea of wonder and kind of the culture of collecting exotic curiosities in European elite culture. So I was just wondering, obviously there is an element where looking back on a part of history that, the Tudor period in England, where you wouldn't think of people of colour as being present, it does challenge that, but I was wondering whether there's a danger that there is this other context of these kind of people being collected as a kind of exotic curiosity in the context of kind of European elite culture.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question, and a very difficult one to answer. A lot of work has been done on, or I say a lot, comparatively, a lot of work has been done on sort of trying to gauge Tudor attitudes to race and Tudor reactions to race. And I think an element of it's very difficult to phrase, but sort of cultural sort of worldliness of European monarchs is certainly identifiable. And I think exoticism is certainly present. The trouble is sort of looking back, we have inherited an awful history of exoticism and persecution. And it's difficult not to transplant that back onto the Tudor period. This isn't the best answer to your question because I don't really know is the answer. But I would certainly lean towards looking at sort of cultural worldliness, bearing in mind exoticism, and trying to sort of negotiate this awkward sort of looking back posthumously, if that helps.
Are there any more from the audience?
Oh, that's fine. This is a question for Joe, and I found your presentation really interesting. But for me, it raises the question, in the current climate where there's so much talk about groups not collaborating, whether you think that same sort of invisibility is promoted by the press, or whether you have any awareness whether this type of collaboration still goes on.
Well, thank you for that really nice comment. To answer your question, I think definitely there is that sort of collectivism still. I know the trade union is still really heavily involved with things like fighting for LGBTQ rights and things like that. But I think because its power has been, the power of trade unions generally has been so eroded throughout the Thatcher period, I think it's a lot more difficult now for that, collectivism and that relationship to achieve the things it's achieved before. So I think that's maybe why it's less invisible, just because it's generally less powerful. So I don't think it's particularly gone away as such. Just it's waned a little bit.
Just to add to that, I think it's interesting that LGSM is now lesbian and gays support the migrants. Also, we're seeing staff strikes where there's a wave of student and staff solidarity, and also the UCU strike is including demands around the gender pay gap, the racial pay gap, and connecting that to the BME attainment gap, etc. So, yeah, I mean, we still have that collective spirit to an extent, but doing the same work in the same period as you, I have realised that has waned to an extent, and I'm still trying to trouble that as well, as you probably are as well, Joe. Any more questions? Over here, yes.
Hi. Sorry, I've got a sneeze brewing and I can feel it coming, so I'm really sorry if it comes. It's my question for Joe, but it's also for yourself as well. I'm somebody who studies the same, I'm sure you can tell, the same sort of period of time that you guys do. I'm looking at the 1980s and the 1990s in America. Do you feel, as somebody who is studying the same sort of topic, and I'm sure anybody else who is as well, do you feel that there's a struggle to try and present our time period as valid history? Because I feel it's something that I'm struggling a little bit with within the subject of history, to present it as a valid period of time in history, especially for marginalised groups. So I look at the AIDS crisis in America, but it's of the same sort of period. And when I first heard about LGSM, I looked into that, and I've looked into these topics in Britain, but I decided to study America. Have you guys ever found that you're finding it problematic to present to some people, not all, that this is a valid period of British history, or in my case, American history, and it shouldn't be ghettoised to gay and lesbian history or marginalised history, because it's as important and fundamental a part of British or American history? I just wondered your thoughts on that at all.
Shall I go first, because you just went? Is that, yeah, would you prefer that? Okay. Thank you for that question. I've actually been thinking about that a lot myself. One, because I'm black and queer and a woman in Britain researching that history. So I've been asked a lot, oh, how do you do that? It's so personal. How can you remain critical? Which obviously, which I think is strange, because even if you do British history and you look at the 20th century or like the 18th century, what sort of colonial legacies are you imparting? Anyway, and you're a white historian. But aside from that, I think so for instance with my project, there is some sort of a cultural renaissance, quote unquote, in Britain around Black British history. So in terms of like why I should study it, it's kind of a hot topic, and I think that's why I got funding as well, because there are a lot of politics around that. The way I think of researching the Black gay and lesbian movement, and I'm very much at the early stages, hence I'm just doing a case study of the BLGC, is that I'm not thinking of it in terms of just, people were black and gay as well. I'm thinking about it as, what does this tell us about the politics of black liberation or black political activism in Britain, and transnational connections between black people and people of colour in the 20th century. I think with political activism amongst any diasporic people of colour in Britain, you can't confine it to national boundaries as well. What else should I say about this? Also, I think the lines between what is kind of valid traditional history in the academy and what is outside should be blurred, and in my instance they are. And I'm conducting oral histories with people like Veronica, and I want to interview Jamu X, Topher Campbell, etc. And those people have been working to preserve and archive their history. So I've been problematising who is the historian, how do we define the historian? So I guess I don't really care too much about whether it's valid history to an extent. I'm just kind of using my little in the academy to do something that I find interesting, and that needs to be done. Yeah.
That was really, really well put, Sue. So I'll try and talk a little bit about, you mentioned sort of a problem with conceptualising time, and there's a really good piece on this, or a number of pieces by a guy called Mark Fisher. I definitely recommend looking into him, and he talks about sort of time being less structured and sort of stranger in the 80s and 90s as a consequence of neoliberalism, and he talks about it in terms of a break. He says we can see things a bit differently. Culture's more pervasive, and therefore the period's harder to sort of pin down and define because of the culture, than it had been in previous years. So I can't really provide you with all the answers to that, but that may maybe be a good place to look. Thank you for your question.
Do we have time for more questions? Yeah. Okay. Any more? Oh.
I just wanted to say really great panel. This is really exciting and very interesting. My question is for Lily. I'm really kind of concerned about the way in which you kind of generally use the word woman and the kind of generalizations you make about the middle class in the 19th century, I guess in late 18th century. And I wonder how historicizing that perspective might be. But I wish you could speak a bit more about the availability of that kind of middling class to people of color, particularly women of color, and how, if all, they were involved in these strikes that were during this period.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think it is really important. At the moment, I haven't really, my research was mainly on white, middle class women, which I do see as definitely a criticism of my research completely. More now, more now my modules specifically in my third year looking at, black women in 18th century England, looking at people like Dido Bell, for example. But I think there is a lack of research in black women in the lower classes specifically, I think that's a fair criticism, definitely, and I'd love to look into that.
I think I saw another hand over here. Yes.
My question is also for Lily. I was wondering about the concept of philanthropy and if you'd looked into that more in terms of your overarching question and how that plays into what you're trying to say.
I do focus a lot on philanthropy. My dissertation is going to be a comparison between anti-slavery and comic relief, and our concept of kind of philanthropy and how it links to the British identity. And I think definitely throughout, the 18th century started this sort of identity of giving to people that they didn't necessarily didn't know the lives of, at all. And I think that's really interesting and what I'm hoping to delve into more with my dissertation, because it's definitely, it's really interesting how that's being constructed and how it's still apparent today, and how we have this identity of wanting to give something, which I think is really interesting. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you. I thought everybody's talks were very interesting. But I have a question for Jo, because I have a particularly personal resonance with your talk, because my family, basically every man in my family was a pit worker at some point in their life. Just going back just a couple of generations, my dad is probably the first person who wasn't a pit worker. But we come from Erasure, so I was wondering if you knew much about how the groups that we were speaking about, or other groups related to miners' strikes in Scotland.
Thank you. So the miners' strikes were, contrary to what maybe the general popular perception, were massively diverse. So you have some areas that are really, really militant, like South Wales or Yorkshire, and then, as I mentioned, some areas that are completely against a strike, sort of complicate the issue, like Nottinghamshire. Particularly with Scotland, my focus hasn't been too much outside of Yorkshire, just because of scope and things like that. But it'd be definitely something I'd be interested in looking into. I don't know if there's anything you could tell me or inform me that you think may be interesting.
I'll think and maybe tell you later. Any more questions, or should we wrap up? One more. We can have one last question.
You covered a period of over 400 years. Could you just give an indication to us of the balance that you saw between deliberate suppression and erasure of history and the application of subconscious bias? People of colour don't matter, women don't matter. What was the balance between those two factors, do you think, in the amount of resource that was available to you for your research?
I don't know if I would create the division between those two forces in that way, because I think that so for instance, with my research in post-war Britain, as soon as you had this idea of, the Windrush era, you then had this kind of systemic kind of regime process where you defined and rigidified the boundaries of whiteness. Not that that wasn't happening before, but and successive, and the introduction of successive immigration acts, which reduced the ability for people from the Commonwealth and former colonies to come to the metropole. So, and then within that, you then have whiteness defined in opposition to the coloured migrant. Hence, why you have this idea of the revolution, like you have the idea of political blackness in Britain. I also think that, and because of that, and the fact that most people of colour in Britain made up the working class, and then you only really had, a wave of people of colour going to universities, I believe, in the 1980s, etc. I'm still tracking it. And then in Julia Sudbury's book, Other Kind of Dreams, on the Black British Women's Movement, she says that one of the reasons why the Black Women's Movement was erased was because in the 1980s, when the Academy was looking to, 1990s, looking to introduce black feminism, they didn't look to women of colour, they looked to the US, which I think is symptomatic of this idea of there are no people of colour in here, that there's this idea, in Britain, I guess the national project is we'll just erase instead of maybe tokenise to an extent. Secondly, also, in the late 20th century, you did have a lot of people of colour academics getting jobs, and then they weren't offered jobs in Britain. Hazel Carby writes in one of her anthologies about the fact that she had to then go to Yale. So I think in the midst of that, you don't then also have documents being put into the archive, and documents for grassroots organisations tend to not be put in the archive unless they interacted with the state. So there are, but with all that said, I was able to access a lot of sources because as people were organising, I guess history has always been so central to the idea of political movements, especially amongst post-colonial migrants in Britain. So they kept these documents. They thought it was important. The BCA came out of someone keeping stuff in their house, and then eventually got funding. So there's this kind of balance. That was quite a messy answer to something. Sorry. I'm gonna pass on.
A fabulous question. Certainly for my research into the Chapel Royal, which evidence-wise is pretty hellishly lacking. That's partially a problem with Geoffrey Elton, who in his 1960s, one of his 1960s books, I actually can't remember which one, he pretty much just dismisses the Chapel Royal. There's some amazing stuff that has been done in the early 20th century into the Chapel Royal, but that is obviously written at a time of intense racial prejudice. So accounts and histories do reflect that. I think speaking wider for the Tudor period, there is an inherent bias for a lot of the historiography against people of colour and other marginalised groups, as well as that the fact that I struggled to do any sort of intersectionality in my work reflects that, I think, because it's pretty difficult for an undergraduate student to do it. I should also say I don't think I am the right person to be doing a study into the people of colour of the Chapel Royal, because I'm a white straight man. I absolutely shouldn't be doing it. And hopefully people might get inspired and do it.
Sorry, I was going to have to stop you guys there because we've got to go for break. So please could you be back here by 12:45? But the beauty of a break is also that you can continue these conversations just through that room. So if you have any other questions for our panellists, then please feel free to approach them. And thank you so much.